Thank you. So without further ado, I want to open the conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. It's super great to be here. You know, the group of people who are really dedicated to solidarity and action and the better values of what our government should stand for. I haven't met everybody, but I'm Peter Kornbluh from the National Security Archive in Washington, and I know that sounds like a very sinister government kind of place. And sometimes we are mistaken for the other NSA. We refer to ourselves as the archive, not to be confused with some type of government agency that's very secret and dedicated to secrecy, where we're very open and dedicated to transparency. But I have found that when I go speak in Latin America, there is sometimes confusion whether we are with the government or not, for people that don't know us. So I take with me our t-shirt from our Latin America team, which reads, "Documentos o muerte." And I say this is our revolutionary slogan, documents or death, because we spend our time trying to get documents classified and used for debate over U.S. foreign policy in various countries, but particularly a lot of Latin American countries. And I also, I'm in charge of the Cuba project at the National Security Archive. We've gotten tens of thousands of documents released on various episodes of aggression, but also a lot of documents released on the whole secret history of efforts to have a dialogue between Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and the U.S. government. Somebody has my book lying around, Back Channel to Cuba, which chronicles all of these things. What page are you on?
Well, I've done the first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters.
Oh,
I just finished the epilogue.
You got through the Kennedy chapter. That's a good one. The epilogue is pretty interesting.
And then I went back to the, what's he say, the guys who were flying over their Skymasters.
Brothers to the rescue.
Brothers to the rescue.
Yeah.
And that, I have a question about that.
Can you pass it around?
Oh, no.
Well, and I also have the great fun and honor to be the kind of lead writer for The Nation magazine on Cuba. And to get to go to Cuba quite a bit with The Nation
Then you're
magazine.
taking a trip, but it's full.
Well, the next trip is full. There's another trip in May that there's room on, and then there'll be another trip in the fall.
Oh, and you're doing them all?
No, I'll do the one in the fall, but I'm doing the next one.
Yeah, I know that. So how do we get on that list? You just sign up, nation.
Well, you sign up. You can go on the Nation website, give them your email, and they'll send you ads for all these things. But anyway, I do get to go to Cuba, and I do get to write for The Nation. And I actually have a piece in The Nation magazine that's arriving at your doorsteps this week, basically titled, after Venezuela, is Cuba next? And this is one of my tremendous concerns. As you know from reading the epilogue of this book, we were able to really be part of and track this extraordinary accomplishment of the Obama administration and undertaking 2 years of secret diplomacy with Raul Castro and his office and his intermediaries and negotiators, and arriving at an accord to actually, reset relations with Cuba and reset relations with the rest of Latin America in a very positive way by kind of ending the perpetual hostility in U.S.-Cuban relations and opening up full diplomatic relations and starting to work towards normalized commercial relations. Frankly speaking, all of that is in great jeopardy of completely going down the drain. The whole policy of President Obama, positive engagement, is now turned into, under Trump, negative disengagement, and worse. And this is why it's so imperative. I try and be optimistic, but my mother always used to call me Peter Pessimist. And even though I actually thought that President Trump would had kind of, been rhetorical, a lot of bark, but no real bite about changing the policy, it's now clear that he has put a team in place in the White House, led by John Bolton, who really do believe that the United States should get rid of the governments of Venezuela, the government of Cuba, the government of Nicaragua, and essentially control events in Latin America. And the Venezuela opportunity, and Venezuela, sad to say, mismanagement, the corruption, malfeasance of the Maduro government has really handed an opportunity to an imperious, interventionist inclined White House on a silver platter. And the rest of Latin America is completely unsympathetic to Maduro's staying. Many countries in Latin America have been quietly working for now over 2 years, almost 3 years, on mediation, on meetings, on efforts. There's been efforts to recruit the Cubans to try and be a forceful interlocutor, because the Cubans do have some influence in Venezuela, certainly more than any other country. And all that has failed, and this crisis has suddenly developed with a little clever maneuver of the National Assembly. And now we are really in a situation that threatens to deteriorate, not only in terms of kind of U.S. force in Venezuela and regime change, but embolden this team of people in the White House to go further. I don't know if you remember that right before the midterm elections in November, Donald Trump went to Florida because he wanted to tout his candidates there and back them. And just before he arrived, John Bolton arrived and gave a speech at the Freedom Tower in Miami to a large group of anti-Castro Cuban Americans, which has come to be known as the Troika of Tyranny speech. And he disparaged the leaders of all the three countries. The Troika is, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. He disparaged all their leaders as the Three Stooges. He completely disparaged Obama for going to Cuba, for going to the Jose Marti monument, for having his picture taken in front of the big facade of Che Guevara. I think you saw that picture. For shaking the hands and coming to a deal with Raul Castro, and for basically adopting a civil diplomatic posture towards Cuba. He completely and publicly disparaged that. And he made it clear that the United States was going to watch, as he called it, the three corners of the Troika fall, in Havana, in Caracas, and in Managua. And we all dismissed this speech as political posturing at the time, because he was going to Florida. He was obviously trying to get out the hardline anti-Castro vote for the candidates that the administration was doing. But in retrospect, it seems clear that he was signaling that there's a new sheriff in town. He's in the White House, and the hegemonic presumption in U.S. policy towards Latin America is back, and everybody who doesn't like that better look out. What's happened now is, as you watch the arguments and the attacks on Maduro, you see very clear signs that they have decided that they're going to blame Cuba for what's going on in Venezuela, and use that argument to try and isolate Cuba, try and cast Cuba in the same vein as Venezuela, try and build the argument for overthrowing the Cuban government as well as the Venezuelan government, and more immediately use this argument to justify new sanctions against Cuba. And those sanctions are coming fairly soon. Could be a couple of days, could be a couple of weeks. Depends on how things play out in Venezuela over the next week or so. And these are difficult sanctions. They appear to intend to redesignate Cuba as a sponsor of international terrorism. The State Department has a special list. North Korea is on it now, Sudan is on it, Iran is on it, and there's 4 countries on it now. Being on the list carries significant economic sanctions to deter other governments and other companies from investing or offering any kind of financial support to the states on the list. One U.S. official told the Miami Herald that they are going to blame Cuba's support for Maduro kind of to justify putting Cuba back on the list. Some of you here in the room, I know, are veterans of the Central America struggles in the 1980s, and you'll remember that when Ronald Reagan was trying to make the case that revolution was terrorism, he decided to put Cuba on this list for supporting the insurrectionist movements in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, and for, of course, backing the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Cuba stayed on this list even though there was no evidence at any time that the Cubans supported international terrorism. And in fact, it was quite the contrary. Cuba was a victim of international terrorism repeatedly during the, almost how many years was it? It was 1982 to 2015. They were on the list because no president had the, how should we put it, chutzpah to take Cuba off the list and face the screams from the Republican senators and congressmen and the Miami Cuban Americans by taking Cuba off the list. And finally, as part of this effort to normalize relations with Cuba said, hey, you know, we shouldn't be on that list. We should never be put on the list. It's an insult to us that we're on the list. It's part of normalizing diplomatic relations. You should take us off that list. And Obama agreed. John Kerry did a whole review in the State Department, pro forma. I'm now trying to get that review declassified and into the hands of people like you and senators and congressmen to fight back, push back against having Cuba be put back on the list. And that's one of the sanctions I think we're going to see very, very soon. The second sanction is somewhat even more of a nightmare. It's part of the Helms-Burton bill, which was passed in 1996. And that bill was sponsored by Jesse Helms, who you all remember, may he rest in peace, and Dan from Indiana, congressman at the time. It's a very hard line bill that essentially tries to penalize all the other countries around us who have a normal policy and a normal relationship with Cuba and trade with Cuba and have companies that invest in Cuba. And there's a provision in the bill that was passed in 1996 that would allow U.S. citizens and Cuban Americans who lost property after the revolution, properties were expropriated and turned into kind of state properties, to sue in U.S. courts for claims and damages and supposedly force the Cubans or any other foreign entity that has, quote, trafficked in confiscated properties to pay up. Well, there's an estimate that 200,000 lawsuits could be actually filed under this clause. The clause threatened to create such tension and trade problems with our allies in Canada, Mexico, France, England, Germany, you name it, that President Clinton insisted he would not sign this bill unless there was a provision of a waiver, that this clause could be waived. This clause, this was called Title III, could be waived by the president every 6 months. And every president since 1996, now we're talking the rest of the Clinton administration, we're talking George W. Bush. We're talking Obama, of course, and even the first 2 years of Trump has waived this, implementing this part of the law out of the sensitivity to the crisis it's going to create internationally with our own allies. Until now. And now, instead of waiving it for 6 months like they would have normally, Secretary of State Pompeo announced that they were only going to waive it for 45 days. And then, on all these foreign businesses, better reconsider investment in Cuba in trafficked properties. And already you have businesses in many other countries that are considering investments in Cuba, stopping this process, trying to figure out where they would be liable. You have conceivably even the U.S. airline companies that are flying in and out of Cuba now, and that you and I have been flying on for the last few years since Obama authorized direct commercial flights to Cuba for the first time. Those airlines could be sued as well because there are parts of the airport that were originally private property, parts of haciendas around the outskirts of Havana that were appropriated after the revolution and for the expansion of the airport. So there's a lot of worst case scenarios here, but this is one of them. And of course, if those airlines stop flying, you and I would not be able to fly to Cuba the same way we do now, if at all. And I think there's going to be additional sanctions on travel and additional restrictions on travel, which will not only hurt the Cuban economy and the growing private sector that caters to U.S. tourists, the private Airbnb rentals, the chauffeurs and the old cars, the new private restaurants that some of you have gone to, the Paladares. I mean, really the core and the pillars of the growing private sector and Cuba that are so critical for Cuba's future. Not only will it hurt that, but we have our rights to travel to Cuba, and we really should be standing up for those rights. So I have grave concerns that this kind of opening the door on Venezuela and the empowerment and emboldening process for these regime changers in the Trump White House and the imperious president that we have really doesn't care what the international community thinks, doesn't care about international law, really would like to be able to throw his weight around someplace close to home and easy to show what I don't know how to say it, make up for his little hands, I don't know. I really fear that this is one of the worst crises, given these circumstances in Washington, that we could face, and that it really is a significant danger for not just Venezuela in the end, but Cuba thereafter, and beyond. So I hope what we would do tonight is I know you're already working on this and you're sending letters. There are some things to think about. There's been just this past week a new proposal in the Senate by Amy Klobuchar, who's running for president, to lift the embargo in its entirety. If that could be voted on, if it could actually pass, it certainly would send a message that the Senate, and then presumably the House, is not in favor of this aggressive position towards Cuba, and like the opposite. They would like to see relations normalized as Obama set out to do. There's, in a couple of weeks, unless all hell breaks out in Venezuela, there's another bill for freedom of travel that's going to be introduced into the Senate by Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And this is the bill that would be most likely, I think, to have full support because frankly, this is about the rights of American citizens. It's not really about Cuba at all. It's about us finally saying enough of these Mickey Mouse efforts from buying things in Cuba, going Cuba, I mean, let us travel freely as it is the constitutional right of U.S. citizens to travel. I'm working on a whole history of efforts to challenge the travel ban to Cuba. It's quite an extraordinary history. It involves many activists and solidarity people like yourselves over the years, going back to the early '60s. And I think we have to really step up and start talking about those issues as that issue as well. And I mean, most fundamentally now, pushing for a mediated solution to the Venezuela crisis, and making it clear to people in Washington that the American public's not going to support the use of force and regime change in our region, forced by the United States, is so important because once the door opens on this, the next 2 years or 6 years, who knows, are really going to be very difficult for this region. And so we could, talk about all this. You guys already have your very specific efforts and mechanisms for opinion airing here in the Denver area. I don't know. I can't remember who your representatives are, whether they've gone to Cuba or not, and whether Colorado has any economic.
She wasn't even very good with the SOA.
She'd forget that she was
So,
against it.
or whether there's any businesses here in Colorado that have established any exports to Cuba. But I do have great faith in the power of community action and solidarity work to prevail. So I'm rooting for you, and I'm going to help in any way.
Coming here, I just heard real briefly on NPR, so I don't know who said it or whatever, but they said that given our long history of intervention in Latin America especially, that the repercussions were so great of our intervention that it kind of canceled out anything good that came of it for America. And I was just blown away that they would admit that and maybe use that as, a little second thought about trying to invade Venezuela.
Well, to the degree you can copy that, quote it, share it,
Yeah.
endorse it.
I don't know who said it. I'd have to go back because I know what time I was listening.
You can log on and hear it
Yeah.
again. We all can log on and hear it and see who said it. But there certainly has been a lot of criticism of the U.S. roles in overthrowing Allende and intervention in Brazil and the Contra War in Nicaragua
And the
counterinsurgency operations in El Salvador, which thousands of people were murdered, and so there's no end of this sense that this is not wrong and immoral, but bad for the U.S. reputation in the region. Now the region, unfortunately, has changed recently, and particularly the change in government in Brazil has kind of given Trump an opening with a significant power. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the Colombians to accept the presence of U.S. troops. I would not hesitate to predict that there already are special forces teams focused on Venezuela in Colombia already. We want to figure out any which way to shame the Colombians into standing up for their own sovereignty and nationalism and not becoming a staging ground, not becoming kind of another Honduras. We used to, during the Contra War, during the wars in Central America, we used to call Honduras the USS Honduras because it was essentially a landed battle station for the United States forces for the rest of the region. So those are the areas that we definitely want to highlight as this situation threatens to deteriorate further. sure a number of you have very good ideas about how to go forward on this, but yes.
Thinking about Cuba and the opening that we've had over the last few years, and I don't know the extent or the statistics on US businesses that are doing work there. What is that commercial group, do they have any force in terms of affecting policy? Because they're gonna be hurt.
Yes, here are industries like the airline industry, the cruise ship industry, which is, I don't know if you know this, but over 620,000 US citizens went to Cuba last year, in 2018. Unbelievably, half of them went on cruise ships. That's true kind of middle America going to Cuba. And even though I would hope that a number of those people, having gone, would become kind of advocates for hands off of Cuba. But certainly the owners of all these cruise ship lines that are making a mint on these travels have an investment. The airlines have significant investments now, kind of in their agreements, their gate agreements with the Cuban government, and they've been making some money. I don't know if they're making as much money as they hoped they would, but they've been making some money on these routes. They obviously are very wealthy, have significant lobbyists. Key lobbyists, most interesting, this is really fascinating, that Major League Baseball finally signed an agreement with the Cuban Federation of Baseball to be able to recruit and use Cuban players here in the United States. And they have spent $2 million already lobbying the administration to approve this agreement. Now, as part of all this pressure on Cuba, it's very unlikely that it's going to be approved. And plus, Marco Rubio has come out against it because his claim is that this money that Major League Baseball will pay to the Cuban Federation of Baseball will just go into the Cuban military. When in fact it'll go to the Cuban baseball, which is very important in Cuba. I had the honor of going with the Baltimore Orioles to Cuba in 1999 for the first significant kind of episode of baseball diplomacy, and then I was there with Obama when he went to see the Tampa Bay Rays play the Cuban national team during his visit 3 years ago, and another episode of baseball diplomacy. And so, there is a great pride on both sides, and this is a beautiful agreement. It keeps Cuban baseball players from putting themselves in the hands of coyotes, get out of Cuba and come to the United States. People who have exploited them, kidnapped them, demanded ransom to let them go. The horror stories. And that's been the lobbying argument that Major League Baseball has made. But Marco Rubio wasn't consulted on this, and then he came out against it. And he's now been lobbying very, very hard. If you have any solidarity way to pressure him, you'd be helping the cause, because he really is a kind of shadow Secretary of State now on these policies, and he's a player in the policies of aggression towards Venezuela, but his end game is Cuba. He cares about Venezuela only to the extent that Venezuelan support for Cuba through now lesser exports of oil and some humanitarian aid is helping the Cubans. So that's his effort, is to separate Venezuela from Cuba and weaken the Cuban state and the Cuban economy that way. It's quite an insidious effort.
Thank you. I guess I have a question and maybe two questions. One, I traveled years ago, a long time ago, before we had kind of this better relationship with Cuba. So at that time, I think the laws haven't fully changed, that you had to have like either an educational reason for going, a journalistic credential, something like this to go. So I went with a journalist credential on a U.S. Cuba-Youth exchange, and an international exchange. And so I know with the restrictions being softened with Obama, there's these direct flights, and I've had friends that have gone, but I thought that there was still this IRS component of you can't spend American money unless you're going on one of these kind of trips, and so these cruises might have some educational component or something like this, but I'm not sure, so I'm asking. And then my other thought is that even I think the messaging has been so obviously slanted with Venezuela, with Cuba, that even liberals here in this country see these as terrible dictatorship regimes, right? So we're countering that message with progressive people, I think, here in this country too, with so much misinformation, a lack of a balanced perspective. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, on how to better address.
My thought on trying to somehow reposition the narrative on Venezuela is A, that it's impossible. It's impossible because it's deeply ingrained. It's impossible because of the deep collapse of the Venezuelan state and the responsibility that only Nicolas Maduro and to some extent Chavez himself has for what has happened there. That's not to endorse in any way a U.S. policy of intervention or an effort to push Maduro out. It's simply to say that if I was a Venezuelan, and I was facing hyperinflation and lack of medicines and lack of food and the migration of 10% of my countrymen abroad and incredible violence, criminal violence, street violence that mostly affects poorer Venezuelans, frankly. I mean, you wonder how is it that the whole country didn't rise up several years ago, frankly. So it's just impossible to defend. And I guess I would say also likely a lost cause. But, and the problem with then trying to focus on criticizing U.S. policy does become difficult because those two things kind of go together. You criticize U.S. policy, are you defending, the legitimacy of Maduro? And it's not about legitimacy anymore. It's about a situation where the Venezuelan state has collapsed and it's a failed state, essentially. But it's affected so many other countries in the region that Maduro has no sympathy among the other countries in Latin America who, under normal circumstances, would oppose these pressures from the United States. And in fact, historically speaking, did oppose them in 2002 when Chavez was very briefly kind of sequestered by a small clique in the military who were trying to pull off a coup. And the United States initially supported that clique until the entire OAS came rolling to the door of the State Department and the White House, hollering and screaming, "We will not tolerate the U.S. regime change in Venezuela, even if you don't like, Chavez." And kind of a miracle occurred, some degree of Cuban involvement as well, and Venezuelans came out to the street to call for Chavez's release in great masses, and the military people who had him let him go, and the coup was a thing of the past. So, that's not the situation today. It's very, very different. So, but what you do have in the world is, not just in Latin America, but the European Union as well, in the United Nations, everybody kind of working on this and wanting to mediate and offering various plans for plebiscites and new elections and time periods for power sharing and these kinds of things, which so far neither side has really agreed to. Just like the Pope played a key role in the secret diplomacy, bringing Obama and Raul together back in 2014, both Maduro has approached the Pope and Guaido has approached the Pope as well for some type of mediation. So we'll see what happens with that. On your question of travel, the travel situation has changed. You went, presumably, during the Clinton days? It was the early years of a few exemptions that you could go under. Obama expanded the list of exemptions. You should all know that the travel restrictions are part of the embargo. And the embargo, the embargo was a presidential directive up until Clinton gave it away to Congress in February of 1996 and allowed it to be codified as part of the Helms-Burton bill. This was after the Cubans shot down these two little brothers to the rescue planes that were encroaching on Cuban airspace and had encroached repeatedly on Cuban airspace. In the United States, if you read the story in the book, very complicated efforts by the Clinton administration to restrict them from flying to Cuba, telling the Cubans that they had been now grounded and they wouldn't come anymore, and then failing to actually keep them from flying over Cuba again. Raul Castro gave an order for his Air Force that he commanded at the time to shoot them down when they were shot down. And the uproar was pretty big, and the momentum in improving relations stalled, and Clinton felt not only forced to sign Helms-Burton, which he wasn't going to sign until that point, but also to give in to this demand by Helms's office that they codify the embargo, which included restrictions on travel. So now it's going to take a vote in Congress to actually lift all of the embargo and all these restrictions on travel. So what Obama did, though, is he expanded this list of exemptions to the travel restrictions. If you were going to Cuba on religious grounds, if you're going as a journalist, if you're going for educational reasons, if you're going at the invitation for professional presentation. But what he did in this one case of people-to-people diplomacy is he said, it used to be that you had to apply for a license to go under the people-to-people category. But Obama said you don't have to apply for a license anymore, and any individual can designate themselves as a people-to-people ambassador as long as you talk to the people of Cuba. That's what people-to-people is all about. They're still prohibited to go vacation in Veradero if you march back through the Miami airport with a big sign that said, or a big tan that said, I was in Veradero, or a t-shirt, they would stop you. And today, the guards, you get channeled when you get off the plane from Miami through a special set of immigration officers who slyly and casually say to you, so how was Cuba? Were you there for business or pleasure? And of course, if anybody is foolish enough to say I was there for pleasure, you're going to get stopped and tweet for going, fined for going. But Trump, so many people started to go under this category of individuals, people and staying at Airbnb places in Havana and across the country, Vinales and Trinidad, etc. And tens of thousands of people were going, couples, small families, more organized tours as well. Trump came in, and because he believed he had a campaign promise to the Miami Cuban American community, and because Marco Rubio, who was his sworn enemy during the campaign and now is his buddy after he became president, he wanted to keep Marco Rubio happy, but he just did this little thing. He eliminated the people-to-people category for individuals, because Marco Rubio went in and said, all those people, all those U.S. citizens are going to Cuba by themselves. They're just lying on the beach in Veradero, which is categorically false. The people who are lying on the beach in Veradero are all Canadians. They fly in on a plane from Toronto to the airport in Veradero. They never leave the massive resort hotels there, and it's part of a package that's been going on for 30 years. And they fly back. And thousands, a million of them a year do that. But U.S. citizens are all interested in knowing what the hell's going on in Cuba. And they go through Havana, and they travel in the countryside, and they stay in private Cuban houses, and because they want to know the Cuban people. And It's just been a thing of beauty to watch our two societies come together. But Trump eliminated the ability for individuals to go. And then, this gets back to your lobby question, Airbnb, which really was the business that made a lot of money off of the kind of opening of the Cuba market. When they went in there, there was like 2,000 homes that were on Airbnb, and within a few months, there were 22,000 Cuban homes on Airbnb, and everybody using them. And Airbnb went in and started lobbying the Trump administration to expand the definition of a different category, which was called support for the Cuban people. Now that category had been in there, and it was very suspect because it basically mandated that you spend time working with civic groups who opposed the government, presumably, and that's how you supported the Cuban people. But Airbnb's argument was, you know, if you stay at Airbnb instead of at the Hotel Nacional, you're supporting the Cuban people because it's a private home. It's not owned by the state, and the state really doesn't. The state gets taxes on rentals, but they don't get the majority of that money. And so they lobbied and lobbied and lobbied, and basically the Treasury Department simply decided not to say anything about this. And so everybody who's going as an individual now is checking off support for the Cuban people instead of people to people. And we're all there are people that are doing that, including many of my friends. You have to then actually steer clear of the state-owned hotels and state restaurants and have an itinerary that does make it clear that you are spending time relating to private sector Cubans, artists, drivers, private restaurants, etc. This now is going to change, though, and if Cuba gets put on the terrorism list, that's going to not only scare off individuals and people from the United States from wanting to go, but it will, for insurance reasons, lots of universities that let their students go to Cuba will probably have their lawyers say they can't go to a country that's on the list, just for safety reasons, for insurance reasons. Because if something happened to them, you know, their parents would come and say, how did you let our child go to a country that's one of those 5 terrorist countries on the list? So it really is, could be a dramatic setback.
About Amy Klobuchar, how did she get involved, and what is her history relative to Cuba?
She's a senator from Minnesota.
No, I know, but
she's a liberal, and she's been a voice. I remember I was on the Charlie Rose show with her after Obama went to Cuba. I don't know what her particular incentive
but she's actually
is,
has a bill to get rid of the.
And not only that, she introduced a variant of the same bill in 2015 and the same bill again in 2017.
What is her
she's
bill?
reintroduced it for the 3rd time.
To get rid of the
embargo. Now I don't know I think that, you know, if I was to guess, I think that the milk industry in Minnesota or the cheese industry in Minnesota, or one of the industries in Minnesota is selling agricultural goods to Cuba and wants to sell more. The Cubans were very astute when they had a little bit more money. They were buying agricultural products from key states where there were Republicans, key states where there were swing states, and really, you know, trying to get U.S. business really deeply involved in states where the representatives could vote in favor of better policy towards Cuba, and that really could change the dynamic.
Isn't Cargill based in Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Not only are you right,
Yeah.
and Cargill is one of the big supporters of this bill, and they all along have been the leading
Amy
company.
is the senator from Cargill, basically.
They have been the company all along that has been pushing, that led the fight in the 90s to push Clinton to change the embargo laws, create an exemption for food and grains to be sold to Cuba.
Wheat, corn, soybeans, and beef.
Right. So,
Sorry, I have a question. Thanks to you. And so I was just thinking when you mentioned the title Venezuela, Cuba Next, and this kind of disconcerting shift in South America. We see many countries obviously have turned to the right, and obviously seeing the situation in Venezuela. And I was just curious, I guess, if anything, what might make Cuba different? And I keep thinking of the case of Mexico kind of being different, because they were also normalizing relations. They've now, elected someone from the center left, obviously they have their own problems with Trump right now, but kind of what would be the position of an actor like Mexico if this situation were to come like that in Cuba?
Mexico, along with Uruguay, has offered to mediate the crisis. They've refrained from taking a position on any side, whether Maduro should stay, or whether there should be elections or anything. They've simply said, we offer our good offices to try and find a solution. The New Mexican government could be one of the significant players in the region, but so far the agenda there is clearly, Lopez Obrador is to clearly focus on changing the situation inside Mexico.
Right.
He already has this the migration crisis with Trump, which he's also been very astute about, careful and quiet about, to the extent of it almost feels like he's abandoned these refugees who have come through Mexico. But that's very complicated. He's clearly trying to not pick a fight here. And I don't want to say rightfully so, but I can't really condemn that. Mexico could very much be a leader in the region, but without kind of more support than Mexico, we're not going to get too far here. And of course, I think the Mexican government is completely aware that U.S. intervention in any other country in the region, and particularly Cuba, is going to set up a bit of a firestorm among the left in Mexico. And this has been the case all the way back to the early 60s. It's still the case now. And luckily, you have a president of Mexico be sympathetic to those arguments, as opposed to before when we didn't. But we'll have to see what kind of position of leadership Mexico plays. Almost every country of significance in the region has offered to play a role in a solution here. And of course, so far, nothing has happened. And I want to say, it hasn't just been since since Venezuela developed overnight an interim new president to compete with the president that they had. For the last 3 years, the Latin American community has been working openly and quietly to try and find a solution, because the refugee crisis in Latin America is Venezuela has really had impacts on their society. I don't want to say negative impacts, but impacts. And every country is feeling the humanitarian crisis flowing out of Venezuela and wants to see this solved and stopped.
In Cuba, what is the revolutionary view of the capitalism coming into Cuba?
Cuba is in a period of long and uncertain transition. It started that transition when Fidel Castro fell sick in 2006 and turned over the reins of power to his brother. His brother had a somewhat more pragmatic view of the changes that were needed in Cuba, and actually worked very quickly to implement some of them, including deciding that there would be a private sector in Cuba from which a third, if not more, Cubans on the state payroll would eventually migrate to, and would create a base for a tax system and what we would call a market socialist economy, as opposed to just a strict kind of communist centralized system that they've had all along. And And that transition started. And it obviously gained great momentum. And then this shocking kind of opening with the United States took place, which many viewed as very positive, but there was still a kind of a feudalista faction in the Cuban government of very strict hardliners who were very suspicious. They were very suspicious of Obama's motives, and perhaps they were very suspicious of the scenario that has occurred, which is that this would be very temporary, and so now you have a different, a further leadership transition with Raúl Castro stepping down last April, a younger leader, Miguel Díaz-Canel, who is not widely known in Cuba. He's known in the particular province where he was the head of the Communist Party, the provincial leadership. He was Minister of Education. He seemed more modern, but it's not exactly clear that he's in charge of what's going on in Cuba now. And there seems to be a lot of positioning in the Cuban military, and this Venezuela thing is going to be a test, I think, to see where the leadership is. There are very mixed opinions in Cuba. On the one hand, kind of people, and some people in the leadership do understand that Cuba really has no choice but to modernize and open its society, and that means having a private sector. Having a private sector means having modern business access and internet, and that's been moving forward, actually. On the other hand, inequality in Cuba has changed. People who are in the private sector certainly have more means, and people who are still on the state payroll of $25 to $30 a month have far less means. And the evidence, even though unlike our society, where people walk around with lots of great clothes and drive fancy cars, and there's all sorts of symbols of wealth, big expensive buildings, in various better off neighborhoods, etc. Even though you don't have that in Cuba, the differential is still clear to everybody, and that has created a real tension between people who want to go back, start to restrict the private sector as opposed to letting it blossom in order to create more evenness with the non-private sector, and others who say that Cuba has to stay on the path towards modernizing its economy. And it's a real struggle, it's a real division, and it's hurting the country, which is in its own economic crisis even before this current situation in Venezuela. Venezuela, kind of, it's an interesting thing, Cuba, Fidel Castro wrote a very harsh kind of rebuttal to Obama's visit in 2016, where he basically said Cuba doesn't, need anything from anybody. So if the United States is coming to offer this and that, we don't want it. But of course, Cuba has needed a benefactor for this revolution to have done what it did. And at first, that benefactor was the Soviet Union, and there was a kind of a whole complex barter arrangement worked out that really allowed the Cuban economy to kind of keep going with the arrangements with the whole Soviet bloc. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy went into this huge tailspin called the special period. Nobody in Cuba, everybody in Cuba that's old enough remembers this, and nobody wants to go back to it. And you really get a sense that people are going to say, no, we do not want to go back to it. We're not going back to it. And you really do get that sense, which is an eye-opener in a controlled state. Cuba, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they really had to hunt around. First they turned to the Chinese. That didn't last too long. And then Chavez emerged and started giving the Cubans what they really needed, 100,000 barrels of oil a day. And Cuba was getting enough oil from the Venezuelans for its own needs. It would also refine in the Cuban refinery about $1 billion worth of oil and sell it to other countries around the world. So there was another $1 billion worth of kind of exports coming from this extraordinary relationship with Venezuela. And that largesse ended towards the end of the Chavez era, before he died, when the gasoline and petroleum industry started to deteriorate significantly, and eventually those exports were cut more than in half. And that's about where we stand now. So it's been a real crisis there, and all these sanctions and these pressures have come to exacerbate that crisis considerably. Well, I don't want to take up more of your time, but I would like to hear all the cool things you're able to do to stand up against our government committing any further injustices in the region.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is a little veering off because the situation in Honduras is obviously different because Juan Orlando Hernandez is a right-winger. But there we're supporting a government that's doing, in many ways, similar things to what's happening in Venezuela. I don't think much of, obviously our current administration and its supporters like Marco Rubio, but it's such a just contrast that we feel so for the Venezuelan people, and we don't recognize the atrocities that are taking place in Honduras. And I'd be interested in your comments, but also what you know of the reactions of other Latin countries to Honduras.
Honduras, Guatemala, to a lesser extent El Salvador, these are also failed states, in the sense that the governments are essentially controlled by cartels and mafia factions and riddled with corruption. That could not be more the case in Guatemala. The impact of those failed states has the impact on migration to the United States, which Trump is railing about all the time.
Yeah, we don't like root causes. That analysis would be.
So I don't want to encourage him to go in there and get rid of rid himself of those governments either. And it's not clear how that's going to change over the short term, but without some type of major development, economic development in those countries that creates conditions to offset the drug industry and the impoverished state of affairs. Venezuela is somewhat more dramatic for a number of reasons. Plus, it's become unlike those countries, it's become a battleground of almost going back to the Cold War era of superpower conflict. The Russians really are deeply embedded now in Venezuela. They have bonds on half of the 50% of the Venezuelan oil industry. I'm sure this is very uncomfortable for the United States, even though Trump is the person now that's abrogated the ongoing flow of oil from Venezuela to the United States. That flow continued under Chavez, that flow continued under Maduro for all these years until now. Maduro has been forced, because he doesn't have any money, to kind of trade off percentages of his main resource, the oil, to the Russians in return for loans. And so you do have the Russians and the United States now creating a battleground in Venezuela. Plus, you had a country that was truly one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America and in the world, and now is a wreck. So there's that drama. And third, you have quite a few people coming out of Central America, but 3 million Venezuelans in the scope of 5 or 6 years is a lot of people. And there isn't any sense that this is ever going to improve under this government. It's not just our sense, it's the region's sense. So basically to deal with the situation that's come up now. They're trying to deal with it.
Well, at the risk of launching an argument, I gotta say, I think that if you characterize Venezuela as once wealthy, and today it's a wreck, and it's a lost cause, and essentially that this experiment, now only 20 years old, has failed, that the country's a basket case and a failed state, that you're conceding the terms upon which the United States is basing this pending overthrow of an elected government. And I think those premises have to be reversed, and that the defense of Cuba and every other state in which people attempt to make an experiment has to be defended on the principle of absolutely no right of the United States to intervene, no matter the excuse. It will always be based on the notion of some humanitarian crisis. That is, this lady has pointed out, there are humanitarian crises everywhere, including Venezuela.
And the U.S.
Right, including Venezuela in 1998, when Chavez was first elected overwhelmingly. And rather than see Maduro and his coterie as somehow hijacking that experiment, I think we have to say that all experiments by humans are subject to all sorts of potential human frailties and even failure. But none of those things are right to other people to use military force and, in the ultimate regard, assassination attempts, which the United States has committed in Venezuela, has fomented those coups, and has spent the last 20 years trying to strangle that experiment in the same way that they did in an attempt against Cuba, the same way they did in Guatemala in 1954, and especially the way they did in Chile, and you and I both know because we were associated with it, from 1970 to 73, when the CIA director, Richard Helms, recorded in his memoirs and notes that were only subsequently made public, that he was handed the baton by Nixon and Kissinger to overthrow this government by any means, and that it was principally that track one, as they called it, of economic strangulation, make the economy scream. They've had 20 years to do that in Venezuela, and now, in fact, people are screaming. But it's the United States that has implemented this strangulation through sanctions. It's economic warfare.
Let me just say that I disagree with that thesis. That Venezuela is a rather large country which had a lot of richness and resources, and the United States is not responsible for the collapse and mismanagement of the Venezuelan economy. Yeah,
The United States has no role in hyperinflation.
No, the United States does not have any role in those decisions.
I disagree
with that money. So
I think I
can say
cannot.
the Venezuelan situation now is completely different from the Chilean situation, but it's not worth even comparing it. I made my point perfectly clear earlier that not defending Maduro is in no way a position of somehow supporting or defending Trump's position of intervention. We absolutely have to be against that. And I mean, accept your position, irregardless of what we decide or what language one uses. The focus obviously needs to be on on what the U.S. Is doing, should do, should not do now. So I can only say that I will, work for whatever time in my career is left to get the documents declassified on U.S. policy towards Venezuela over this last 15 or so years, so that the next generation of us working on this has an empirical history to draw on. I do think personally it's going to be different from the Chilean documents that we have going back to the 70s. That's my prediction. But we're faced with the situation as it is now, and to do what we can. So that's.
Well, the government had rigged elections. Instead of saying, well, people need to determine their own. That's impossible in Venezuela, right? I mean, it's impossible for them to determine their own future, I mean, it really is impossible. So you can't wait for that to happen because the guys are crooks.
Well, the Venezuelan people still have their own right to self-determination, and if they take to the streets and push Maduro out, then I have great respect for that, given what they've been through. But it's got to be on their own, and not with the
Well, no, I agree. Yeah.
support that the Trump administration is now giving them. So.
I saw a poll of Venezuelan people that said 86% of them didn't want U.S. intervention, and something like 81% also didn't want the U.S. sanctions. So even people who want Maduro out apparently don't want the U.S. intervening in a number of ways. And I'm afraid, as the gentleman pointed out, we have been since the beginning trying to overthrow Chavez. And there's an incredible movie you may be familiar with called Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And it's about how the people came out of their barrios and got into the streets and demanded that he be put back into office. I don't see the same sort of thing happening with Maduro, although it's not entirely absent either.
I can say that I don't think that's going to happen with Maduro, but Chavismo as a kind of a movement, may well survive this transition that, in my opinion, is inevitable now, and because it is a significant sector of the population, as a principle, because the whole kind of revolution side of it, for the most part, no longer truly is functioning at this point. But I'm sure there's people who would like to see that part of it restored, and whatever government comes into place, if it's going to be responsive to the needs of all Venezuelans, it's going to have to address that issue.
And there's still some amount of community councils, and I was amazed their media, here it's represented as just no space for private media at all, but it's more of a mix than that. They did remove the charter of one private media company, but they were involved with the coup. But they had an interesting public media going on, community radio stations, they had documentary films, they had union people given a voice. So there was, there's remnants of that. And there's also support from Cuba still. There's a lot of security personnel from Cuba. Bolivia has been saying a lot of things about U.S. involvement. And I heard that Evo Morales is going to start an institution to counter the SOA and their operations with just countering their attempts to sabotage, which are relentless. And I think the sanctions, have been not spoken about. The ramifications of the sanctions, also are very much economic warfare. And I know it's getting late, but if you could talk about some of the ramifications of the sanctions. We did the same thing with Iraq. They were devastating. I know they weren't the same, but they're very intense. I think a lot of us don't realize how that works.
I had an experience with Nicolas Maduro in 2015 when I was with the White House Press Corps, and we were all in Panama for the Summit of the Americas, where President Obama was going to actually meet Raul Castro for the first time. They already had this breakthrough. Now they were going to consolidate it with a president-to-president meeting in Panama. So I was there, and Maduro flew in, and he actually flew in about 700 or 800 Venezuelan activists also, all to condemn the United States. And he held a rally in the neighborhood in Panama City, which had been bombed by U.S. Marines when we invaded Panama in 1989, killing about 130 people. And he, at this point, the Obama administration had issued sanctions, in part because of congressional pressure, but they weren't broad sanctions. They were specific sanctions on 11 of Maduro's top officials, which basically means their assets are frozen in the United States. They can't come to the United States, and really not much more than that. And it was a symbolic statement. It really wasn't. But he had whipped up this idea that this was the prelude to U.S. intervention, and this was the worst thing that had ever happened. And he had gained, as he said, 100,000 signatures that he was going to personally hand to Obama. It was going to be this big stunt. Pardon me?
He seemed right in his prediction that it was a prelude to U.S. intervention.
Well, but this was back in 2015. It wasn't a prelude to U.S. intervention.
We've
So,
been involved already.
so he hadn't gone through the next election fraud at that point. So, anyway, you know that one can go back over this all. The main, I was mentioning that only because the majority of the administration's sanctions so far, up until this last point, when the oil was cut off, were these targeting individuals. They weren't broad efforts to cut U.S. investment in Venezuela or cut off the oil. But now, with this turn of events, they were going to cut off the oil, seize the Venezuelan holdings, money that we owe them, and give it to Guido for his
fascists.
to him for to legitimize his ability to somehow spend his money. You know, you have to ask yourself. The truth is that the opposition in Venezuela doesn't control any of the banks. It doesn't control any of the ministries. They don't have their own agencies to go out and distribute anything. So and there's no way for him to have this money kind of given to him in a structure in which he can distribute it to the Venezuelan people. There's a bit of a facade here. And in some ways it reminds me a bit of the scheme that the CIA had at the Bay of Pigs, where they were going to invade Cuba, they were going to fly in these exiled politicians, put them on the beach, and recognize them as the new government. They were going to hold a beachhead for several days, say, okay, now this is territory in Cuba controlled by a new group, where the leaders would fly in, they would declare themselves, you know, the leaders of this controlled area. The United States would recognize them, and then you'd have a competing government. So it was a bit of a real scheme, and this reminds me of that. But I don't know what the expectation is that this will go forward. I think there is the U.S. plan is obviously to chase Maduro off and bribe the Venezuelan military to defect and seize him or threaten him if he doesn't leave, and that's what's at play right now.
No, I was wondering.
I should just add to finish your question on the power of the sanctions. You know, that's a lot of money. We're talking billions of dollars. Because of the economic crisis in Venezuela, Maduro doesn't have any other customers who actually give him money for the sale of oil. His other two customers, the Chinese and the Russians, have already given him loans in which they are taking oil as payment in response. So there's no cash that comes in. The only cash that was coming in was from the flow of oil to the United States. And now that has been cut off. He can redirect those tankers to another country, such as perhaps India, who conceivably would pay him. But all of this takes time, and in the interim, there is no cash flow of really almost any kind into the country.
Yeah.
And so these are important, these are strong sanctions for the first time.
You know, in some ways, China has been our benefactor. I mean, if they were to cut us off, our economy would be screaming for sure. Is Bolivia, is there something they're able to do in terms of solidarity? I mean, I'm surprised they're not.
Bolivia has no significant power, position, or resources to affect anything.
I'm surprised they haven't been named.
They're a political solidarity ally of the Venezuelans, having received quite a bit of oil money over the years.
Well, I was going to say, it's pretty predictable to all of us to look at what John Bolton wants, what Elliot Abrams, for God's sakes, wants. But what I don't understand is why are there so many other countries that accepted Guaido's pronouncement when it seems so, ridiculously usurping. And it's pretty clear that there's a lot of Venezuelan people, I know people who are really sick of what Maduro's doing, but that doesn't justify then subverting any kind of, democratic norm.
I mean, a number of those countries, if you look, had already said back at the time of the election that they would not recognize Maduro's claim to legitimacy for several reasons, and that so you already had a fairly large group that had at that point of the election said no way. You can go back and look at who those countries are, and now look at the countries here that have recognized Guaido quickly. And then you have a whole second tier of governments who are not firmly recognizing the opposition here, but are positioning themselves to be mediators, and are clearly ready to see Maduro leave, just not in the scenarios that the Trump administration wants. This is part of the difficult situation, though, is that the United States is hardly isolated here in its efforts to shape this outcome, and the isolation of Maduro goes back essentially to the time of these presidential elections a year ago.
But those countries don't want an intervention. They don't want a military intervention. And the U.S. is somewhat isolated in that particular issue. They want the transition, but not military involvement.
I don't know. I think Brazil is supportive of the Trump position, and it's unclear what the Colombian position is. Colombia is the one that's affected most by the record.
But the Lima group has said they don't want military intervention.
Right. And the European Union group doesn't want it either. So whether that's enough to counterweight, John Bolton doesn't really care what any of it so, but we'll see. This is why this is still in play. The outcomes are uncertain, and I hope that it gets resolved without that. But we could gain, as they do in Washington, they game this out. The military sits down. What would happen if Maduro decides to say? What would happen if the military says we want you to leave, and we're putting you in jail if you don't go? Take a hike and go to Cuba into exile, and we're going to appoint one of our people to head the country. What happens then? How does that resolve anything? What happens if Maduro decides to imprison the new opposition leaders, and Trump takes this as a personal affront, sends troops to Colombia, or even sends a team in to, extricate the opposition leaders. I mean, there's all these scenarios. We're gonna hopefully get engaged and work on this, but this is the one of the real crises of our times, and there's a lot of crises of our times, unfortunately. This is going to be one of them. Anyway, I don't want to deplete your energy any further, so we'll go out and we'll do what we can. If there's anything I can send you from Washington that's helpful, I will.
Thank you.
So much.
everyone for being here.